Mr. Ryan, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Representative McGovern, Representative Ellison, and Representative Crowley. Solidarity Center wants to also thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
We need to have a little order. Thank you. I apologize.
No worries. Really appreciate your interest in the issues of labor in Bangladesh and this opportunity to talk about the state of labor rights in Bangladesh today. I've been involved with worker rights in Bangladesh for the past 15 years, and the Solidarity Center has long been engaged with all the stakeholders, with the workers, the employers, and the government to improve labor rights in the country. If we look back over the past 20 years, we can see that there has been some incremental progress over time. An important example would be the reduction of child labor in the ready-made garment sector. However, according to Bangladesh's own Bureau of Statistics, there are at least 7 million child laborers in the country today, including in agriculture, manufacturing, mining, domestic service, and hotels and restaurants. In two Solidarity Center reports issued in 2008 and 2012, child labor and other labor rights issues abuses persist in the shrimp and seafood industry. In the bigger picture, long-standing, persistent, and broad labor rights abuses continue across many industries and in some cases have accelerated in the past 3 years. This is true even with the return of the civilian government. For example, over the past 3 years, hundreds of garment workers have been injured and some killed in clashes with police while demonstrating or on strike for labor rights, most often higher wages. Several prominent labor activists have been arrested and taken to trial on trumped-up charges associated with these demonstrations. Why do these strikes take place? The immediate reason is the objective conditions under which Bangladeshi workers in all sectors toil are among the lowest in terms of wages and most dangerous in terms of safety and health in all of Asia. But the broader, more pervasive context for these strikes and violence is workers' lack of basic freedom of association to organize their own unions. Trade unions in the ready-made garment sector have been refused legitimate registration, suppressed, their leaders fired, and in some cases destroyed by management with the government's acquiescence. Because their attempts to organize have been thwarted, workers have no or few channels to or mechanisms to voice their grievances and negotiate with management to improve their rights and working conditions. As recently as last week, U.S. Ambassador Dan Mosina was quoted in the Dhaka press as saying, quote, U.S. companies want to buy products from Bangladesh, but they are very concerned about the labor issues, safety at the workplace, and freedom of association in Bangladesh. This represents a fundamental failing of the government of Bangladesh to enforce its own labor laws and its commitments as a member of the International Labor Organization. The most notorious of the recent examples of violence against labor activists, as noted previously, came with the murder in early April of Aminul Islam, an organizer for the Bangladesh Garment and Industrial Workers Federation. Aminul trained, recruited, and organized workers in the garment sector and the export processing zones. Due to his activities, Aminul was threatened by gangsters working for garment factory owners, was continuously under police surveillance, and was detained and beaten by the National Security Intelligence Agency in June 2010. False criminal charges were filed against Aminul along with his colleagues at BGIWF and the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity for supposedly causing unrest during the minimum wage campaign by garment workers in the summer of 2010. The investigation of Aminul's case by the Bangladesh authorities continues, but observers both in Bangladesh and internationally are very concerned that no credible, transparent, and accountable investigation will actually take place. What all these events demonstrate, and the Aminul case in particular, is that the broader application of freedom of association in Bangladesh is actively and daily destroyed by employers and willfully abetted by the government of Bangladesh. While the AFL-CIO in its GSP submissions has acknowledged some progress in the past in the export processing zones and originally in the shrimp sector, unfortunately the picture today is one of wholesale backsliding in both the EPZs and the shrimp sector. Neither employers nor the government have taken any real action, and there's been absolutely no progress in the largest sector, ready-made garments. Continuing worker protests and violence against demonstrators up to today amply demonstrates this. What can and should happen presently to improve the labor rights picture in Bangladesh? First, pressure and advocacy from both Bangladeshi and international labor and human rights organizations must continue across a broad range to press for real freedom of association in Bangladesh. Secondly, the Bangladesh business community must recognize that its actions to repress workers have consequences, not only in terms of impoverishing its own workforce, but also injuring the industry's reputation in the eyes of other governments and the Western brands upon which they depend for business. The brands have a key role to play in this regard. Third, the Bangladesh government should continue to be held to task to live up to its international ILO commitments, and if it does not do so, should face more punitive actions by the ILO's governing body. Fourth, the AFL-CIO's GSP petition, which I asked to be submitted for the record, provides a litany of those issues that the government of Bangladesh and employers need to address. And the U.S. Trade Representative should keep the pressure on for the government of Bangladesh to seriously address and remedy those issues. Otherwise, such trade benefits that Bangladesh currently enjoys should be suspended. The Bangladesh government has choices about development policy and how to best bring its people out of poverty. The strikes, violence, and continuing worker dissatisfaction with the status quo demonstrates that the low-wage, low-rights model is not its best option. And U.S. government, ILO, and NGO pressure can help the government to change course and support its workers as they attempt to better their own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sifton?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to start first, again, like my other witnesses, thanking you for holding this hearing today. The human rights situation in Bangladesh certainly deserves a lot of attention, not merely from this committee and the U.S. Congress, but from the world over. The governments abroad and the European Union, United Nations body, businesses, labor groups, humanitarian agencies, the media, the people of Bangladesh have suffered a great deal of human rights abuses over the last few decades, and it certainly would be the case that having those abuses be less ignored would be of a positive impact. I think it is impossible to run through all the human rights issues that could be discussed, and so I'd ask that a copy of the written testimony that I submitted beforehand be put into the record.
Without objection.
It's been posted, just for the benefit of everyone here, it's been posted on Human Rights Watch's website simultaneous with this hearing starting. So if anybody would like to see a sort of broader scope issues, we've put that online at hrw.org. I will run through a few of the issues that I address in the written testimony. I address 6. Labor rights, which Mr. Ryan has already gone through, extrajudicial killings and impunity, restrictions on civil society, which came up on the first panel, refugee issues, including the issue of the Rohingya, and issues involving women and girls' rights. And lastly, issues involving the International Crimes Tribunal. I cannot address all these, so I'm going to just choose 2 in my remarks. Since labor rights has already been addressed in quite some detail, I'm going to discuss first the issue of the Rohingya and second, issues of impunity with the Rapid Action Battalion. I want to say first, though, that Human Rights Watch would like to acknowledge that on a broader level, in the past 3.5 years, the government of Bangladesh has taken some positive steps on human rights, not just the ones I'm going to talk about, but generally. The government has enacted a law against domestic violence and introduced a national policy to advance women's rights, for instance. The government has taken an important step to protect the rights of minorities, at least on paper, when it passed the Vested Properties Return Act. The cabinet also approved the Hindu Marriage Registration Bill in 2012. And the overall environment for human rights NGOs has improved from the dismal situation that it faced under the caretaker government, and previous governments for that matter. Human rights workers, critical journalists have not been subjected to threats and killings as frequently as in the past, although obviously the fact that they still are is a major concern. Media freedom has also improved, and I think that needs to be acknowledged, even though it still faces significant threat. And one last thing, after a Human Rights Watch report on the subject of crossovers into India, the Bangladeshi authorities have started demanding of India an end to the indiscriminate and excessive use of force by Indian border guards, who often simply just shoot Bangladeshis as they're crossing into India illegally. I think the overarching problem we have with the current government is that while it's swept into office promising to have a zero-tolerance policy for human rights abuses, in the actual practice, we've seen the government turn a blind eye. We really welcome the fact that the United States government and Secretary Clinton and Assistant Secretary Blake have pushed so many of these issues forward. During Hillary Clinton's visit to Dhaka this year, she pushed very hard on all of these issues. It's on the Bangladeshi government to rethink its approach to human rights reporting. The recalcitrance that this current government has shown, which is quite surprising given the fact that they themselves often alleged human rights abuses when they were in opposition, has been incredibly frustrating for us. At the end of the day, I think the first step to all the improvements for all the problems that have come up is that the government needs to admit that it has problems. As long as it pretends that it doesn't have problems, I mean, this is something we face when we talk with them, whether it's about refugees or the Rapid Action Battalion. As long as they deny that there's a problem, deny that there are problems, or suggest that attacks on them are some sort of conspiracy against either their party or the government or Bangladesh, generally, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's the big issue. But two issues, okay, in a little bit more detail. On the Rohingya, since there was some interest on that, I'd like to say that we are going to be putting out a report shortly about both the situation inside of Burma and what's going on the River Naf with some of the folks coming over. It's a deplorable situation inside of Rakhine State in Burma. Essentially, the violence escalated into whole-scale torch and hack and kill and rape of Rohingya citizens. There was some violence against Rakhine as well by Rohingya themselves, but by and large, the biggest forces were against the Rohingya, and it not just involved ordinary Rakhine civilians, but the Nasaka forces of Burma, the border guards, as well as local police, sort of helping civilians commit this horrible violence. So as a result, not surprisingly, a large number of these folks fled. From fleeing from farther south in places like Sitwa, they had to take a 2-day boat ride out into the Bay of Bengal and come up the mouth of the River Naf and try to land somewhere there. Many of them were intercepted by the Bangladeshi border guards at sea. Others made it ashore but were then captured. We interviewed quite a number of them in various areas along the River Naf. Journalists did as well over the past couple of weeks. And they described, in some cases, being sent back into Burma and trying to enter again, which to us was a testimony to how desperate they were. Inside of Bangladesh, we've seen the border guards begin to sort of engage in a mutiny of sorts and not exactly rigorously enforce the orders that have been given them to turn back Rohingya. We have reports of authorities essentially turning a blind eye when folks are lucky enough to make it into Rohingya communities around Cox's Bazar, which is a little bit farther up the coast. But when folks are found at sea, they are turned back, and that remains the official position of the Bangladeshi government, and it is a serious, serious concern. Now, because the violence in Arakan State has reached kind of an equilibrium, which shouldn't be confused with peace and security, but an equilibrium because many of the people who have fled have reached wherever it is that they've sought to go and are now displaced. An equilibrium is set in, and so the numbers of people crossing into Bangladesh appears to have gone down. But as recently as a few weeks ago, days ago really, there were hundreds of people still crossing over, at least when the weather was calm. And I should emphasize the weather plays a huge role in the numbers you see on a day-to-day basis. When there's very bad weather, you'll see, almost nobody coming in. On the Rapid Action Battalion and impunity, I'd just like to take a second to talk about this. The Rapid Action Battalion is probably the crown jewel of the issue of impunity. I mean, it's the main issue, the focus point of impunity for extrajudicial killings. We've labeled RAB a death squad because, as you've seen in our public statements, because we and others have documented cases where RAB forces have identified individuals, detained them, and then staged shootouts, which they later call crossfires, in which these folks, essentially end up dead. We began reporting on RAB many years ago, in 2005, when the BNP was in power. And I want to just emphasize in my testimony right now that there is no dispute that the unit was set up to be a death squad. BNP officials told us in private meetings that extrajudicial killings were part of the mandate of the RAB from its outset because, they argued to us, corruption in the police and courts meant that powerful criminals could avoid arrest or buy their way out of prison. So, we have to kill them, essentially. So after continued reporting on RAB in 2007 and 2009 during the military-backed government, we released another lengthy report on RAB in 2011. And earlier this month, I want to talk about the fact that we issued a report about the aftermath of the Bangladesh Border Guards mutiny of 2009, which RAB played a role in dealing with. The mutiny, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, was an incredibly violent act, but the aftermath was quite disturbing as well. Thousands of people were rounded up. Many of them were tortured. A few of them were killed. It's not exactly clear how many. RAB played a role in that. The report is here. I'd ask to submit it in the record, and I can provide you guys with some copies. The Alami League knows full well what RAB is capable of. And it's notable that when it was in opposition, they often claimed that its members were killed, tortured, or illegally detained by RAB. And to our great disappointment, although they promised to crack down on RAB during their 2008 campaign, today, they deny that RAB is even implicated in abuses. And that's an incredible disappointment to us. It's a remarkable about-face. In meetings in 2010, 2011, and earlier this month, the Home Minister, to whom RAB reports, has stated that RAB has not committed any unlawful killings since the Alami League came to power. And the Law Minister made similar claims to us. And both have made statements to that effect in the media. So the government is refusing to even consider the facts contained in our reports. They're just saying at the outset there's no problems. We don't know why they take this untenable position, given the facts. And meanwhile, the allegations are continuing. I noticed that in the first panel, this issue of killings going down and questions about the numbers came up. And I would just like to flag that as an asterisk to any discussion about the numbers, it should be acknowledged that it's not always the crossfire killings that we're seeing now. Now we're just seeing outright disappearances. And since disappearances are a little bit harder to document and mark down and quantify because you really don't know exactly what's going on, those aren't addressed in those statistics that have been discussed. So I can answer some more questions about that. I will just say one thing about the aftermath of this report. When we brought this report up to the government, again, it was a complete, utter denial that there was a problem, even though our report has some very, very clear allegations in it. It led us to believe that the government had simply just not read the report. And so we were very concerned by that. I'm going to stop there because you can go on and on about all these issues, but I think it would be easier just to take questions.
I appreciate both of your testimony. I mean, obviously, you highlight some things that anybody who cares about human rights ought to be very concerned with. I just have a couple of questions, one for each of you. Mr. Ryan, as we talked about in the previous panel, Bangladesh has one of the cheapest production systems in the world, and exports to U.S. companies like Walmart, J.C. Penney's, and Sears. I'm just, we've talked a lot about what the Bangladeshi government needs to do. I want to talk about what U.S. businesses and the U.S. Government. What are these companies doing to help improve labor rights in Bangladesh, and what would happen if the U.S. limited imports from Bangladesh until labor rights were improved? And then, why don't you answer that, and then I'll ask Mr. Sifton a question.
Certainly. I did say in my testimony that brands can play a very positive role, and we have seen how the brands can play a positive role in various countries. A couple of points about this, however. The issue for the brands is there needs to be a continued focus and a continued engagement and a continued pressure in order for them to be consistent in their engagement in various countries. I've seen this over the last 20 years in Asia. To the extent that they can put forward a set of conditions, a code of conduct that stipulates the kind of behavior that they would like to see from their subcontractors, that's a useful tool. But it's not an end in itself. And to the extent that these codes of conduct stipulate freedom of association,
right,
that's the kind of space that activists and workers on the ground really need to be able to create the most effective monitoring system, which is democratic unions in their own plants, because they really know what is going on and have the opportunity, given the opportunity, to be able to negotiate and actually improve the standards and the wages with their contracting companies.
So to get this code of conduct, I mean, how would that come about? Who would organize? Would the U.S. Department of Labor try to call all the importers in, and have a discussion about, this is these are some standards here that we expect everybody to live up to, or? Well,
over the last 20 years, most of the major brands, including the ones you mentioned, including Nike, Reebok, footwear, garment manufacturers, garment brands, have created these codes of conduct themselves. A lot of them look very familiar, a lot of them look very similar, but where we see one of the biggest gaps is the ability for them to use these codes to create real freedom of association. We have seen examples, and when I was our director in Indonesia, for example, in the late 90s, right, when Reebok was operating in Indonesia, the Solidarity Center worked with Reebok to use their codes to create the space on the ground in the factories for workers to be able to actually organize their own unions. So we've seen how this mechanism can work, but the code itself is not an end in itself. It can be a useful tool.
May I address that issue?
Sure.
We discussed this with Ambassador Mazina in some detail as well. And as part of the work program, Better Work program, I think there was an idea that there would be an agreement for all the companies to sign on to a better set of standards on workplace safety and all that. But unless you have an effort by the companies to strengthen the legal right to organize, all you've done is you've just gotten a bunch of corporations to voluntarily seek, better standards on the ground. You haven't actually created the legal protections that the workers need.
Right.
And Ambassador Mazina, I think, understands that and sort of sees the Better Work program as a means to that end. It's like one step forward, but the companies then need to demand that the government enshrine those principles in law. Because at the end of the day, you need better laws. You can't just have these voluntary corporate
Well, and
principles.
also the political will to enforce the laws. I mean, some of the worst human rights violators in the world have the most loftiest sounding constitutions. The problem is whether or not people, and that's the whole issue with impunity. I mean, you can have a security force that's supposedly there to protect the people, but if it's being labeled a death squad, and is involved in extrajudicial killings, then the language that surrounds the creation of that security force is meaningless. I mean, and clearly the issue of impunity is a big problem in Bangladesh. Mr. Sifton, what's your assessment of the Vested Property Return Amendment Act passed by the Bangladeshi Parliament in November of 2011? Is the new law likely to be effectively enforced? If so, would it result in net benefits for the country's Hindu and other religious minorities? And to what extent, if any, do you agree with critics who say that the law is insufficiently specific to be effective?
Well, I think it would be remiss to say any law was perfect, because no law typically is. But no, the bigger issue is implementation. And so far we don't see the government having the capacity or the full political will to implement any of the laws that I mentioned to the degree they need to be. But I mean, that's a problem we face across South Asia and frankly across the world. I did want to acknowledge that the law had been put on the books, though.
Okay, thank you. Joe, Mr. Crowley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your testimony today. In particular, I appreciated both of your testimonies, and I just want to point out both of you, in some way or another, also highlighted, I think, some of the positive things that are happening in Bangladesh as well. I think it's important to do that. And Mr. Sifton, you reeled off a number of things, including the last piece of legislation that the chairman mentioned. And I think it's important to note: does the Human Rights Watch file a report about the United States?
It is a subject of. It's one of the chapters in our World Report chapter.
Right.
Yes.
So I think it's clear. I mean, I want to just make this point, and as I think the chairman and others have made before as well, that we're also not blind to the fact that we have faults here in the United States, and we can reel off a number of issues that I think the rest of the world can look at us and ask, well, who are you to point a finger? And so, not only we're not blind to it, the chairman has been one of the most outspoken members of Congress in terms of bringing attention to many of those issues, as is Mr. Ellison as well. So I think it's important to point that out because, as I said earlier, sitting here in an office, in a hearing room, in which everyone has to walk through protection or through screening to ensure that everyone here is safe, is a little bit of a different world maybe than the rest of the world as we know it. We like to think that everything is like we have it here, but it's not. And as great as we have it here, it's not perfect. The point I make that is because when we do sit and we we're inquiring about a country that's an important country, I think, with 150 plus people in it, most of whom are Muslim, and in a world where we find ourselves in loggerheads in many respects to many countries that have such a large Muslim population. And in Bangladesh, we actually have a populace that is, I think, by many accounts and many observations, a moderate nation of people who respect democracy and want democracy for themselves. And they have fought for that, and they paid a price, and millions of people were either killed or displaced or maimed because of their fight for freedom back in 1971, as Mr. Ellison mentioned. So I think it's important to point out that although we tend to not highlight the positives that are happening at hearings like this, we focus on maybe some of the more blemished or negatives about a country. I just want to make a point that you did both mention that there are some things to look at in a positive way. And I didn't want to leave here today thinking that Bangladesh is the basket case that Secretary Kissinger made it out to be 40 years ago. But there are issues. There are issues of concern, and they're concerned, I think, not only to people in Bangladesh, and here in the United States, but around the world as well. Mr. Sifton, can you tell me, can you give me an example of another country that has a disputed border or issues with a border, where if a persecuted people attempt to enter, they are turned back?
With a disputed border.
Well,
because I'm not sure.
Let's not say disputed border. Let's say that regardless of whether the border is disputed or not, is there an example? Are there any other examples of where people who are persecuted in one country, in this case, the Rohingya, who are not given citizenship in the country that they're based in? Putting citizenship aside, is there an example of another country in the world where a people, I have some in mind, but I just want to know if you have any that you might want to.
I mean, there are, but it's becoming increasingly rare that a country would so cruelly turn back people who are so clearly fleeing violence and persecution, and who so clearly are not economic migrants or criminals or whatever it is that the government is labeling the folks. One of our researchers interviewed a man who at one point 2 weeks ago had swam across the river Naf using empty jerry cans tied together, sealed jerry cans, for flotation. He swam across because there were no more boats available. He'd already tried to flee several times. The Nasaka forces in Burma were rounding men up, and he had fled his village because of that. So, faced with folks like that, it's understandable that Bangladeshi border guards would start disobeying orders and turning a blind eye to some of these folks coming across. Because even there's a journalist from Australia who has some great footage of a commander on the dock south of, on one of the docks in the River Naf, where he's saying essentially it isn't proper for a government to turn back people who are fleeing persecution in their homeland.
Do you think the people, the people of Bangladesh, and I know the nature of the free press in Bangladesh and how many newspapers there are, and do you think they are well informed about what's happening in the border?
Well, in the first days of the crisis, I mean, it should be acknowledged that the Bangladeshi press were reporting quite a lot on the plight of the refugees. There was a very infamous case of a woman who gave birth in Bangladesh to a son to a young baby boy while they were in flight. And this case was getting some attention, but like all media cases, it eventually faded. And I think today, a lot of people have forgotten about the problem, even though it was only a few weeks ago. I think by and large, Bangladeshis are not fired up about the Rohingya being let in or not let in. It's not like a hugely controversial issue in the way that the status of Rohingya is inside of Burma, where it's sort of everybody seems to have an opinion. It's an incredibly emotive issue. I think in Bangladesh, by and large, and I would never generalize because obviously it's a nation of many individuals who have different opinions, but I think by and large there are a lot of people who simply just don't care whether the government lets in folks or not. It's a small border in one corner of the country. It's not as though it impacts the country as a whole.
And I do not equate I don't equate Bangladesh with the one example I can think of. I can think of one example that I think is pretty provocative though, and that is the Chinese North Korean border, where the Chinese actually repatriate North Koreans when they cross into it, and we don't know we suspect we know what the outcome of is towards the individuals that are sent back to that country. And again, I'm not trying to equate the two, but I think that that's one example of which you do not want to be associated with in terms of how one treats fleeing refugees in the international standard. Do you think the civilian government of Bangladesh has control over the RAB?
That's a very good question. I think one of the reasons I would suggest reading this report about the Bangladesh Rifles mutiny is because those events in this mutiny in 2009 were kind of a watershed moment for the new government, which was then new. The fact that the military wanted to shell the Bangladesh Rifles barracks in the middle of Dhaka, in which there weren't just the Bangladeshi Rifles soldiers, but as well women and children, as well as other innocent civilians. And Sheikh Hasina told them not to, led to them being very, very angry with her. So angry that there was a whiff of coup in the air, and I think that may have played a role in the government being a little bit more afraid of challenging both the military and the RAB in particular, insofar as it has a military component. It's certainly the case that the government thinks twice about saber rattling when it comes to the military and the RAB.
Thank you. I just have one more question for Mr. Ryan, if I could. I recently sent a letter to the government of Bangladesh in regards to not only the investigation of the murder of Mr. Islam, but also the disappearance of other individuals of note. What is your view on whether the government has or has not been carrying out a proper investigation?
That's a very good question. And as these sorts of processes go on, it takes time and they develop over time. Originally, when I met with Aminul Islam's family and the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity activists in April in Bangladesh, we discussed what would be the best place for this investigation to site itself in the structure to ensure some transparency, accountability, and basically what they thought was the Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, at the national level was the place where such an investigation would have the most credibility. Our understanding as of today is that there has been investigations, that the investigation has been going on at a local level, but seems to be working its way up the chain. It hasn't reached the CID yet. It remains to be seen if it will finally be placed there, but certainly that would be a very positive step in terms of accountability and credibility, seen not only externally by international observers, but certainly by the Bangladesh labor movement and NGOs themselves.
Thank you. And I would just make one other comment, one observation, Mr. Chairman, and as it pertains to your questioning of Mr. Ryan about the influence of American companies within Bangladesh, and I think you hit it right on the nail on the head, and that is the response to the companies in these countries of origin is really linked to the ability of the American consumer to know what is happening in these countries and what companies are participating or buying from these countries in dispute. And that's what I think gives the teeth that's necessary to, it's not going to be something we impose upon them, but really more about the buying public. And that, we saw that with the footwear industry, and we've seen it throughout in other parts of the garment industry, as well as I want to note the progress that Bangladesh made when it was brought to the attention of the government, in the previous government as well, on trafficking. They were able to make movement. Again, not perfect, but they have demonstrated when pressured and when put to test, they have moved when it comes to trafficking as well as child labor. So more to be done, but it just goes to show that when the pressure is brought to bear, that change can be made. So.
And I agree, and if I may just give a couple of other examples. One of the latest developments that I think is very useful is in the wake of the latest shrimp report, which we can certainly make available to you, that the Solidarity Center did. The Bangladesh Frozen Fish and Exporters Association has now begun to re-engage, not only with Solidarity Center, but with worker activists, with an eye toward, let's begin to address these problems, and let's use this report as a baseline against which to measure progress. To that end, we are in the process of discussing an MOU of cooperation with the Frozen Fish Exporters Association, precisely to try to help build the capacity not only of the workers themselves to organize their own organizations, give them the space, and to work to sensitize the Exporters Association and their members. So there have been, as I said, over the years, progress. Our concern was that there had been some backsliding. There are opportunities to go forward, and at every turn, we are looking for opportunities for that sort of engagement.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just once again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. These are not easy issues to discuss, and we don't have enough time in one day or maybe a series of days to really delve into a lot of the issues. I appreciate the report of Human Rights Watch, and I will read it. But I do believe the Bangladeshi people are a great people, a good people, a decent people, and I think they want for their workers what we want for ours, and that is a good, decent standard of living and work environment. And I think what we can do here to help promote that and pressure our own industries here to pressure the Bangladesh industries to do that is going to uplift not only their lives but our lives as well. So thank you for your testimony today.
Well, thank you. Let me just conclude with a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Crowley and Mr. Ellison for suggesting that we do a hearing on Bangladesh. It was at their urging that we did this, and I appreciate it. It's been I've learned a great deal from the testimony at this hearing. I want to make clear, as Mr. Crowley did, that the U.S. relationship and partnership and friendship with Bangladesh is a very, very important one. But I also want everybody in this audience to understand kind of the purpose of this commission, which is to focus on the issue of human rights. Whether it is in the United States or whether it's halfway down the block or halfway down the world, we are a place where people have an opportunity to be able to talk about sometimes some very unpleasant things, and hopefully raise awareness so that there's a resolution to some of these human rights challenges. If one person is disappeared, that's one person too many. If you have a process set up where there is impunity, or where somebody is, or where there are kangaroo courts, or where you're not getting due process, that is something that people who care about human rights should raise their voice. We are not the State Department. We are not the Department of Labor. We are a Human Rights Commission, and the one thing I think we all can agree on here, in addition to the importance of a relationship with Bangladesh, that the Bangladeshi people are incredible people, and they deserve to be able to live in a situation where they can organize, they can be engaged in collective bargaining, where people can disagree with the government, and not face a terrible consequence. I mean, one of the important things about democracy is that our institutions protect people who we even disagree with, and so there are concerns about about a rise in enforced disappearances and some of the excessive violence that we've heard about, some of the extrajudicial killings. The labor rights issues are still very much of a concern. We have questions about the International Crimes Tribunal. That should be a process that is above question. I mean, that is in the interest of the Bangladeshi people. And to the extent that it's transparent, that it is fair, that it is just, we'll get more international support and gain in its credibility. So I appreciate all those who have been here today, and look forward to many more discussions on how we can be of help to the people of Bangladesh, and also advance the cause of human rights. Thank you both.